evening's ReGenAg Chat. So the title of which is Red Meat as a Superfood. So we're going to be joined by Ali Houston and also Dr. Tony Butler. And just before we introduce themselves, we'll do a bit of an update on carbon calling. But Fiona, if you're happy to start recording, I think she is, so that's all super. We'll also capture that bit too. So hello, my name's Liz Jennifer. I'm one of the founders of Carbon Calling. And Nick, I don't know whether you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Nic another founder of Carbon Calling. There's only 4 of us. I'm up in Cumbria, and tonight Liz is up in Cumbria too. So I'm in the bedroom, she's in the kitchen. And yeah, I'm really excited about this next hour or so, talking about meat with 2 amazing guests. So yeah, it's going to be good.
And yeah, so just to give you an update on the conference. So obviously we were due to have the conference this August, but that's now been moved to next June. And so that's the plan. But what is exciting, and hopefully if you're following us on the Carbon Calling on Twitter, you'll see that the demo plots that have been sown by Tim are looking amazing. So they've gone really well, and they've been supplied by Germinal Field Options and also Cotswold Seeds. So they're doing well and have just started to be grazed with lambs. So hopefully by June time next year, they'll be looking amazing. Or so even more amazing.
Even more amazing. So we did some videos with Tim early this week. So I'm going to put those on the Carbon Calling YouTube channel. So you'll see it there on video, and it really is quite impressive. They've done really well. So yeah, it's going to be a good start for the conference.
So as ever, if people, as we go through this evening's talk, if people have got questions, if you want to put them into the chat function that's at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll deal with them as we go through. We have got a structure of what we're going to talk through. So those questions will be, I mean, if you ask a question, it's not asked immediately. The plan is to hopefully get to it at some point this evening. And the real focus is how, from our perspective, is how the sort of red meat is viewed in terms of from a nutritional perspective, and also how we can try and encourage more people to eat it, and how we can try and affect the perception of it in terms of from a health concern perspective. However, I'll stop wittering and introduce you to the 2 people who know more than I do on this, very much on this subject. So we've got Ali and we've got Tony. So Tony, I don't know whether do you want to just do a little bit of an introduction to yourself?
Yeah, surely. I was a doctor. I retired in 2010. I worked as a general practitioner in the university, and like most doctors, I had very little teaching about nutrition and just spouted the usual things that we were told to spout when people said they were overweight or had a problem, and basically I didn't know much about it. And then when I retired, I myself had some health problems, and my wife did, and we discovered that nutrition could be used to great effect to counteract that. And I did a lot of in-depth reading, and more became convinced that the chronic ill health that our Western nations are beset with, such as obesity and diabetes, and that could be reversed in many cases or improved just by changing one's lifestyle, and especially the diet. And then as I got more interested in the diet, I realized that it wasn't just the type of foods that we ate, it was also how nutrient dense they were. In other words, how they'd been produced, what minerals and vitamins they contained. And that, in due course, led me to the fact that I became interested in soil and how they were farmed. So over the course of about 8 years, I've had this journey from not knowing anything much about nutrition to actually now being really interested as an amateur enthusiast in what farmers are doing to try and regenerate the land, improve the soil, produce nutrient-dense food, which has a huge impact on how we as humans can be healthier.
And you sort of been to develop a sort of group, aren't you, Southwest, with health professionals, farmers working
Yes,
together.
I hope so. It's right at the beginning of the venture. We had another group which was all doctors and that, and it's just in the last couple of years I've begun to make contact with farmers and people who make cheese and raw milk and things like that, and to understand that even though it looks like old-fashioned farming methods, it's incredibly complicated, and you have to apply science every day, just as well as know-how and experience in just how you handle your herd. So I take my hat off to farmers if they're really trying not only to go against the trend of chemically type of agriculture, but actually working out on a daily basis the best way to go. I'm so impressed. And so what I want to try and do in the Southwest is to bring together people with farmers, so there'll be doctors and school children and all sorts of people like that, patients, so we can look at human health and soil and climate change and all the things, because it all seems to be linked together in one big important cycle.
Perfect, thank you very much. And Annie, do you want to do a similar introduction in terms of why you're sort of interested in this area, and you'll use the word journey into this?
Yes, thanks very much for having me on. I'm not sure if everyone listening knows that that you, Liz, were on my podcast, but
I've called a favour back in.
So yeah, my background was originally in kind of high-end restaurants, and I took a bit of a left turn and got a physics degree, and was working as a scientist and an engineer. But my health wasn't good at all. I'd had issues since I was a child, really. My weight was up and down. I found that hard to control. I had things like dreadful heartburn, which would kind of keep me up at night a lot of the time. I also had lots of autoimmune problems. So, you know, I had some mental health conditions as well. You know, the whole thing was a mess. And it was when I was actually doing a PhD in physics that they came to a head, and I was having problems focusing enough to complete my work. So something had to be done, and unfortunately my doctors weren't really that helpful, and I turned to the scientific literature around nutrition as a kind of Hail Mary, as they say in America, you know, like a last resort. I didn't really think anything would happen positively, but I switched to what I would call a paleo keto diet, where the things that paleo suggests you cut out, I cut out, and I also went very low carb. And within days, my heartburn of 20 years vanished. And within weeks and months, the other problems that I had pretty much vanished. I was really astounded by this. I was kind of spurred on to do it by my physics professor, one of my PhD supervisors, who'd healed his chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, by doing very similar. I dived into the literature, ended up spending a lot more time reading about nutrition than physics, and decided that I would start a food business based on what I'd learned. And since then, 3 years ago, I've done various things with the food side of the business, and I've attempted to start outreach. Part of that is the podcast, and you know, certainly I would echo what Tony said about my admiration for farmers, who I think can be really beleaguered at times, given the attitude in the general public and certainly the press and areas of nutrition science which gets it all wrong. And I wanted to reach across and join the two worlds of this growing group of doctors and the general public who realize that particularly red meat is the healthiest food. I'd happily go on record to say that, and that farmers should be talking to people about that.
Ali, can you just explain what paleo is?
Yeah.
Just briefly.
So people might have heard of the Mediterranean diet, and the paleo diet is an equally rubbish term. So I know I called my business Paleo Canteen, but it's quite imprecise. the Paleolithic period covers most of human history from about 2.5, 3 million years ago to about sort of 10 or 15,000 years ago when we started agriculture. And so to say the paleo diet is meaningless because humans are opportunistic omnivores and we eat what's there to our preference and abilities. And so what it means nowadays is mimicking what our ancestors would have eaten. It doesn't mean that you can get it right every time. And certainly there's instances of people living in the Paleolithic period who ate very specific diets to that area that I wouldn't consider to be optimally healthy. But what I eat and consider to be a paleo diet would be based on ruminant meat, well-raised monogastric meat, like, you know, outdoor bred pigs, and you know, vegetables, fruit. Some people eat tubers on a paleo diet. I think that's probably about the extent of it. If you're being so-called strict paleo, then you wouldn't eat dairy because that's something that came in since agriculture. And you certainly wouldn't eat grains. So that covers, it's a bit of a fraught term, but that roughly covers it.
Liz, I'm just thinking we have a lot of chat about crunchy nut cornflakes at lambing time.
We do.
Awful.
They would. I don't think the paleo people had crunchy nut cornflakes. I suppose it's an element which is, it's sort of hunter-gatherer type diets, isn't it? So there's still communities around the world that are eating those sort of diets. So meat, a variety of those seasonal products that are available in that area. So I suppose it's a as you explain, it's like a connection. It's a bigger connection to the food you're eating as well, isn't it? It's, I suppose,
Absolutely.
greater awareness.
And what's interesting about modern hunter-gatherers is that they're perhaps not a very good indication of how Paleolithic people ate, because modern hunter-gatherers have been pushed into pockets of land that other people don't want. Certainly there's some untouched tribes in the Amazon, but they're kind of poorly studied. The person who is probably the best source for understanding how traditional peoples would have eaten is a dentist called Weston Price, who was a scientist as well. And he traveled the world a couple of times looking at traditional societies. And when I say traditional, I mean not yet tapped into eating refined grains, refined oils, and sugar. And he found that these people were thriving on a variety of diets. So you could look at the Inuit, who were just eating things like seal blubber and maybe some berries in the summer when they could find them, fish. And then, you know, the Maasai tribesmen in Kenya eating bull's blood and milk, gallon of milk a day, all the way to people in the tropical islands who would eat fruit all the time, fish, coconut, and all of these people were thriving. Great dental health. One or two, you know, he was obviously interested in that, and he found that there was maybe 1 or 2 cavities per 1,000 teeth, just like on a different scale in terms of health. So I would say that era is a good place to look, because they hadn't yet been forced into kind of more desperate pockets, like maybe the Hadza people in Tanzania have, because they've been widely studied. And
Tony, you would describe your diet to sound a bit like Women's Weekly. What would your meal plan for your days, Tony? So what would you be generally eating?
Well, I do something called time period eating, and that means that I tend to restrict my eating time to about midday to about 6 o'clock in the evening, 8 o'clock. So I try and get sort of 12, 16 hours a day when I don't eat. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes I fancy a lump of cheese or something.
Don't we all?
Yeah. But the thing is that I will do my eating in that time, and I tend to be a low carber because of the nature of the health problems I had. So I wouldn't eat bread. I don't eat pasta. I occasionally have white rice, but what I do with that is I cook it and then I freeze it, and that turns it into partially into something called resistant starch. So I'm not as, I do have some rice from time to time. I don't eat potatoes. And I try to eat a lot of leafy green foods and things like that. But I do like meat. You know, as we'll see tonight, I think that's a very important part of the diet because of what it offers. If I can just come back to this hunter-gatherer thing, I think if you listen to what Ali was saying, he was describing very different diets for different parts of the world. And I think what's very interesting is we have to follow evolution, and some of these people evolved within their own landscape and they optimized their diet according to their landscape. And I read a book by a man called Charles Massey called The Call of the Reed Warbler, and he's an Australian farmer. And one of the things he brings out in that book about regenerative farming is to understand your personal landscape of your farm and adapt your farm according to what it's like. And I think in the same way as human beings, we need to adapt our diet according to really how we're built. We're all individual. We've all got different gut bacteria and different genes, and we've had different experiences in life, and we know from something called epigenetics that we probably have altered our gene expression, in other words, whether the genes work to change us or not, by our own experiences and sometimes the experiences of our parents. And therefore, we've all got to have a bit of a personal journey, but I think there are common threads. And if you look at, say, paleo, low carb, ketogenic diets, a lot of other diets, there are common areas to them which I think represent the way we've evolved as omnivores. So there are differences, and people may argue till the cows come home, excuse the pun, it's meant for this thing, about which is the right one. And I don't think there is necessarily a right one. I think it's that they're all on the right track at trying to listen to our bodies, listen to the way we evolved, and the proof is the fact that when people do this, they tend to feel much better, lose weight, are much healthier, lead less medicine. And this is exactly the same as we're finding now in cattle and things like that, that if you actually let them interact with nature and eat what you're providing through nature, they're healthier, they're lower vet bills. You know, it's exactly the same. We are animals in the same way, and we should respect our evolution and respect our bodies and what we put into them. And also we should respect what's gone into make the food that we eat. So I think the quality of the animals and the plants that we eat is also very important, so they become nutritious to us in a biological sense. And
that, I suppose, the element of the nutritional density, isn't it, in terms of that's the value that red meat, do you mean? And I know
absolutely. Yeah.
In terms of views, in terms of the red meat being the healthiest food, but it's also the nutrient density of it, isn't it, that drives some of that?
I mean, if the optimal food is obviously truly pasture-fed, animals that are pastured on lays which have a huge diversity of plant life rather than just ryegrass. But at the moment, that tends to sell for a premium. And what I would say to people, if they haven't got much money, it's still better to eat red meat, even if they buy it at the supermarket, although we would know that that is not as good as the meat that you can get through proper mob grazing and regenerative farming principles. But it's a lot better than the diet that people tend to live on. And if you eat things like meat and vegetables in proper proportions, and you drop things like sugar and refined flours and all those sort of things, you don't get hungry, you stop snacking. Not only improves your health, you find you're spending less time of the day thinking, oh, when am I next going to eat? That used to be my problem. I used to eat 4 times a day in huge amounts. I used to do a morning surgery, and by 11 o'clock, halfway through my surgery, I was thinking, oh, when's lunchtime? I'm starving. And then I'd have a lunch, big lunch. I'd come home and have a big meal, and then I'd have something before I went to bed. Well, I eat once or twice a day now, and I don't feel hungry.
Me too. And it reminds me of the Shreddies advert where hunger strikes, and the idea is that Shreddies are going to cure that by filling you up, when actually they're the cause. And I'm minded about you're talking about feeling hungry. To me, that is the absolute crux of the whole thing, right? So people kind of glibly say it's just a calories in, calories out issue. And I would suggest that that tells you nothing about how your appetite is regulated, which is the real problem. Like if you look at a lion in the wild, they don't have MyFitnessPal to tell them how many zebras they need to eat that day to hit their calorie goal and their macro goal, right? And you just need to look at wild animals that live in an urban environment. We have made them fat. So urban raccoons in the US or Canada, I can't remember, but there is a study on this. We have made them fat by them eating the food that they find. And it's not a scarcity thing either. In times of abundance, with the right food, your appetite will be exquisitely regulated.
I've often wondered, I've never seen research work on this, but I'd love to talk to vets about this. Dogs have been friends of humanity for thousands of years, and they've always ate at the scraps of the table, partly. So the dogs are eating what the people eat. And I wonder whether dogs are now presenting to vets with all the same diseases that we as humans are suffering in all these great epidemics of chronic ill health. I certainly hear people talking about their dogs having diabetes and osteoarthritis and heart disease. Well, do they get that in the wild? I very much doubt it. Because basically a dog is really a carnivore mainly, and they give them dry food and biscuits and all sorts of things.
Fit as a butcher's dog, as they say.
Yes.
And it's back to convenience, isn't it, in terms of well, both the perception that red meat is going to be more expensive, and also the time taken to both research it and then sort of make it. And so all of those factors come in. It's similar to dog. Why is it easier to tip some biscuits into a bowl than it is to go and find some raw meat? Do you mean, so it always comes a bit back to the convenience and how we wish to spend our time? Absolutely.
We've lost this understanding of the importance of nutrition. I mean, it is something you just tack on now to a busy life, hence the microwave meals, the convenience foods, the packets of everything you can just open and eat. The cultures of years ago, especially of Italy and Spain and France, where people sat down and enjoyed slow food, people are beginning to understand the value of that, but it's still hard to do in our modern society because we're so busy. But on the other hand, I mean, you take something like red meat. I would rather eat red meat less often and have the quality than eat it frequently. Although I love meat. I mean, I eat some sort of meat most days. But well-produced red meat, I mean, is so nutritious. A plant-based diet just cannot provide enough. So red meat will provide about, we need about 20 amino acids and about 40 micronutrients and essential minerals. And the trouble is that much of the meat that's being produced these days is grazing on soils that just can't provide the micronutrients and the essential minerals. I think that's what I'd come to the conclusion, and looking at the importance of a good lay to feed the cattle, and they're on it all the time. And then, like we weren't really designed to eat grains, and I'll come back onto that in just a minute. It's interesting how cattle are fed grains, and what does it do? It makes them fat. You fatten them for market, exactly as we find with us. If you eat lots of grains, you get fat. And so that's the trick that farmers have used for ages to fatten them up for market, because they're paid on the kilo. And really what we should be doing is an understanding as a society that the way to grade our food is not how much you pay per pound, it's the quality. And that's where the subsidy should lie. I think that the government should really start analysing the nutrient quality of what we eat and taxing the stuff that has no nutrient quality and give subsidies to the things that have quality. And I think that's the only way that we're going to change it and change our health.
There's a couple of comments sort of coming via the chat. So Tom Dillon, so new studies of microbiome are interesting. Biologically depleted soils are impacting human immune systems. ReGenAg needs to link more effectively to health studies to sell itself. The UK seem to be far behind US on this link. So part of this conversation is that relationship between the products that we're doing via these systems versus human health. And then just a second point, which is more of a comedy, Ella, Peter Morstan said this would be a hard chat for arable farmers to hear, which links back to that statement. But it is, it's on how
when you consider that 70% of the wheat produced in the States is to feed its feedlot cattle, which is a nonsense really, because what they've done, they've ploughed up the pastures where the cattle used to feed, put them in a concrete feedlot, grow the wheat, and which is, in terms of carbon deficit, is huge. I mean, the fertilizers, the herbicides, the ploughing up the land, the loss of...
It has been driven by a perception, or more than that, of margins. Do you mean it's been driven by efficiency, production, and do you mean the hormone use and all of that is driven by the fact is that trying to get as many kilos on that animal as possible.
It's the way the market works, and also once you're on that journey, from what I can gather, the margins get smaller and smaller, so you're chasing them more and more and more. You're stuck unless you have a complete revolution and start again, and that's hard. You know, to ask someone who's 30 years into farming to suddenly backtrack and change what they're doing when they might not make a profit for 4 or 5 years is extremely difficult, I think.
And I think the potential is that as we shift in terms of this, subsidy changes, could some of that be used to support people through that transition phase? But I think, and as Nic and others have in these previous conversations, is about that it has to be driven by what's in the head of the farmer. Where does that mindset come from, and where is it developed?
Yeah.
But for farmers on the call who have we seem to be continually getting bashed for producing red meat, which is carcinogenic and all these kind of things. This is great to hear. But I just wondered, well, both of you, we talked earlier about how when you do box schemes and you sell your meat locally, it's perceived as expensive, and then people who haven't got that much money to spend on food, it's a two-tier system. So we're not really helping the people who possibly want the help most. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, and if you have any solutions.
Well, my hard sell on it really is that we should be eating the whole animal. I think especially if you're eating a low carb diet, you stop using carbohydrates for energy, and you need to replace it with fat. So fat's not an expensive part of the animal. And, I think people have this perception sometimes that a paleo diet might mean salmon and fillet steaks, but I can't remember the last time I had either. Actually, I usually eat like as fatty mince as I can find. Sometimes I've had it specially made where it's like 50% fat. I'll have bone marrow, I'll have liver, heart. These are some of my favorite things, and they cost less than ready meals do. So I think, yes, the prestigious cuts are out with the budget of lots of people, and I think that's just unfortunately the way it is, and it always has been. And I don't think we're ever going to have lamb chops on school dinner menus, and that's okay because there's plenty to go around. And to me that's a very hard sell, because people's palates have changed, and there's a skills gap now where your mum or your gran generally isn't cooking these things like they used to.
Can I come in? sorry, can I come in on the carcinogenic side? Because this is very interesting. It's widely quoted, especially by the World Health Organization, and they've rated red meat now as a carcinogen almost equal to smoking. Now, the first thing is that the science that they claim showed this was observational epidemiology. Now, all that can show is an association. It doesn't actually highlight the actual cause. And what they found, they give relative rates, say there was a 60% increase in cancer of the colon in people who ate red meat. It actually went from 1 to 1.6 cases per 10,000 people. So that's the relative risk. So in other words, it's tiny. It's nowhere near smoking, where you've got a 20-fold increased risk of lung cancer if you smoke. The second thing is, one thing you've got to remember when you do research is what it's called confounders. And this makes a lot of nutritional research almost impossible to do. So they looked at a lot of people who ate red meat. Now, a lot of people who eat red meat in the groups they looked at probably weren't that interested in their health. If you look at people who have plant-based diets, they probably made many other adjustments in their life, like not smoking, not drinking much alcohol, taking more exercise, keeping their weight down by other means. And that has a huge impact on the incidence of other illnesses. Whereas people who eat red meat and revel in it, in America, where they did this research, often sort of are having it in the form of hamburgers and things like that. So they have a bun and they have loads of things, sugar and a Coke down with it. None of this was screened out. So it's impossible to know whether it was the red meat or anything else. So I just don't accept that red meat is a carcinogen. And the other thing to bear in mind is there are big, powerful influences behind some of this. There is a large influence behind the World Health Organization to encourage plant-based diets. And it comes from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which people think is a small thing, but in fact is a huge thing. Kellogg was a Seventh-day Adventist, and he invented cornflakes. And he invented it to actually encourage young men not to engage in masturbation. It is this crazy.
I wondered whether he was going to go there, and he went there. It's fine.
Yeah. And you know, you want, and it has come all down through that line of strange, weird beliefs that are not based on science at all, and they become hardened into culture, and it stops people looking at the real science that we're developing now. And one of the great things that's happening now is we've got a load of people, especially in California, who call themselves biohackers. And they love doing experiments on themselves. In fact, I do occasionally. I use a glucose monitor sometimes and see what effect different foods have on me. And we're learning a lot of science from that. Now, a lot of scientists will tell you single people doing an experiment is meaningless. But if you have 20,000 people doing n=1 experiments, and they come out with 90% of them achieving something, and they can do that in 6 months, that's a very valuable piece of evidence pointing in the right direction where to do the proper research. And a lot of evidence is coming forward that way. Whereas to do a proper controlled trial, you can't put human beings in a lab and say, you mustn't eat any of that for the next 10 years and see if you get cancer or not. It just doesn't happen. And that's why they do observational epidemiological studies, usually based on food diaries. Well, can you remember what you ate 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago, yesterday? I mean, they test them twice a year, yesterday. Over 10 years. So anyway, that's
there's a question there's a question from Clive here, which he has been following your advice and has never felt better. But his question, which is, how do you get this advice out wider? So it's against quite a lot of government policy at the moment.
Well, there are a brave few GPs who've actually got the Royal College of General Practitioners to accept it. There's an e-module for training GPs. It's now accepted by NICE, for instance, that if you have diabetes, that a low-carb diet is one of the diets that can be offered by GPs. 4 years ago, you almost felt like being struck off if you said to somebody, before we try drugs, let's try a reduction in carbohydrates. It doesn't mean to say the majority of people are going there, but it's a start and it's beginning to have an effect. And I can tell you that there is a bit of a double hypocrisy going on in the present cabinet, in that 2 members of that cabinet have lost weight on a low-carb diet, and they are very close to the centre where they make decisions about diet, and they won't admit it and they won't push it forward, but they themselves have gone down that route. And another politician who is happy to explain it, is Tom Watson. If you remember Tom Watson as deputy leader of the Labour Party 5 years ago, he was enormous. And then 2 years ago, he lost a huge amount of weight, but he was so embarrassed that he might be slated because it was against government guidelines. He didn't tell anybody until last year. So there are a lot of people who behind the scenes are in powerful positions who can't open their mouth because they're actually practicing a different way, because that's the way government has to go. So we've got a lot of pushing to do, yeah.
I would agree. There's a big political aspect to it, which just takes a tipping point to be reached. And I would suggest that the major hope here isn't so much people like me making food that caters to this, but it's doctors like Dr. David Unwin, Asim Malhotra, etc., who are, you know, broadly speaking, working together. There's the Public Health Collaboration is a group which I know Tony's involved in as well, and I've been involved with. They, you know, are a group of healthcare professionals in the UK who are showing through their own clinical data that this works really well. And unfortunately for people with a political or industrial or personal motive for suggesting that this stuff doesn't work, you can't really argue with solid clinical data from respected doctors. You know, they're about the most trusted people in society. So it's game over, really. It's just a matter of time as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, yes.
And there's, you know, what's great in America is there's been a bit of a tipping in the American Diabetes Association, which Tony will confirm, I'm sure, up until very recently has been quite against low carbs in a sort of obtuse way. They recently came out and said you can absolutely treat diabetes with a low carb diet, and their CEO is doing just that. So it is changing, and you know, they say the way we think about knowledge changes one professor death at a time.
That's true. And there's a reason for that. I mean, I think the best way forward is the general public to be educated and push. And then politicians respond, because with their focus groups, they like. But if you imagine you're a professor in the cardiovascular department and you've been touting this belief that fat causes cardiovascular disease, and you've got 3 PhD students and 5 research associates with you, and you bring in a grant of £11 million a year to the university for your research, and then suddenly you see the light one night and you go in the next morning and you say, I've changed my mind, I think the Vice Chancellor will call you and ask you to tender your resignation. It's so difficult, people in high places, to actually turn about. Whereas people like me, having retired, it was easy. But I think people like David Unwin, he's a GP in Stockport, by the way, who didn't know anything about this like I didn't. And a patient came in because he called her in because she was diabetic and she hadn't attended the surgery for some time. And he said, I'm very worried that you haven't been to see me. She said, well, I was frightened you'd tell me off. He said, why would I tell you off? She said, well, I haven't listened to anything you've told me about managing my diabetes. Well, he said, you look wonderful and your blood tests are fantastic. How did you achieve that? So she told him. So he went away and studied it and has applied it in his practice ever since, and saves £40,000 a year on lower prescribing costs. And has won GP of the year in 2018 and has got awards from the NHS for it, who still, though, say to him, oh, it's not sustainable.
But in a way, we talk a lot on this with Regen about mindset, and it's once you've kind of seen the light,
yeah,
it sounds a bit fanciful, but once you've seen it and then you start reading about it and, I don't know, watching YouTube, you get kind of hooked on it, don't you? And then you want to kind of spread that message.
I'm sure that happens with farmers into regenerative farming.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a question for you too, I think, if that's okay, which is that, you know, my long-term dream goal is to have a sort of teaching farm, if you like, where it's a working farm that people can go and visit and spend time on if they want, and that it's regenerative. I mean, you know, people talk about the potential elitist nature of a paleo diet. What do you think about the commercial viability of regenerative agriculture, full stop?
Oh, Nick.
Well, I think some of the most regenerative farms I know also make the most money, and I think we don't make a fortune here, but since we've cut out a lot of our costs and our inputs, we just focus on the margin. So I think regenerative can be just as profitable as conventional farming, but it's not a kind of it's a different mindset. So it's not the biggest and the best and the most shiny tractor. It's kind of talking about soil and worms, like Liz and I were half an hour ago. Yeah, so I think it's got huge potential, but I think we probably need a bit of support. That's government support.
And the reality, which is in, I tend to work a bit more in the east, where you've got a lot of depleted soils because of quite a few arable crops have gone in it. So do you mean their return of organic matter is been reduced in the last few years? And so for some of those is that they have to completely rethink how they farm. And so it might not be, do you mean they might not call themselves regenerative, but they have to approach it differently because what they're doing now won't work. So do you mean there's similarities in terms of diabetes management and all those, is that we can't keep going. Do you mean if you continue to do the same thing and expect a different result, then we're all idiots, or whatever that phrase actually is?
Yes.
So I think there is changes are afoot, but it's not necessarily just because people want to affect the microbiome of the people that are eating their products. It's because as a farm level, it's not sustainable in the next 5 to 10 years to continue to do what we do in certain situations.
So do you think government subsidies will help you?
No.
No, if they change the subsidies.
The challenge my view is quite strong on this, which is everybody that tends to be doing something novel and interesting currently and nothing to do with government policy. It is because it is their own decision to go and do something different. And as soon as you have government policy and the levers associated with it, you can have quite detrimental impacts on innovation because people are chasing money or that route.
Yeah,
It doesn't drive innovation.
Yeah, I think where I was coming from. So Joel Salatin is one of our gurus, and he wrote a book saying everything I want to do is legal. So it's just simple. When you're doing things on a small scale, everything is designed for big business. So for example, we wanted to set up a small chicken processing unit on the farm. That is incredibly difficult, and every barrier is put in your way to do that. And it's those kind of, if there was more help with that, that would be, it would make local food much more doable. Is
that similar to the problem with small abattoirs?
Yeah.
So, you know, we've got this cruelty to animals because they have to go long, and the ridiculous thing where somebody on Sky, for instance, to slaughter their cattle, have to take them live to the mainland, get them slaughtered, then bring it back to Sky, when they used to years ago slaughter them on the farm and sell them locally.
Yeah, I mean, local food for local people is just it's just how it should be, really. But yeah,
there's just a few questions, and well, for Ali, there's a contact. Well, for both of you, there's a contact. I apologise if I pronounce your name incorrectly. Madva. I'm a retired GP who follows a paleo keto diet and now farm regeneratively in Somerset. (Brackets recent project. I'm happy for my farm to be used as a teaching ground.)
Oh, can I speak to her? I'm about to email you because we have a common friend, and I will be emailing you tomorrow.
1 second. I will. Yes, but not. Yeah, we'll sort that out.
No.
Great. She says great. And so in terms of oh, I've lost the thread now. Got too excited. So in terms of, I think it comes back to that idea, which is what we were talking about in terms of that change, which is one of the points, which is the too much money at risk from large food processing companies to this big shift in what we would like food production to look like. There is big business involved in the background, isn't it? So how do you get around the marketing and the big sort of investment in trying to get people to continue to eat the
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's hard because any industry in which there is this profit incentive intention with people's health has usually taken a generation to wash out, both through government policy and through cultural acceptability. And Tony mentioned them earlier. You're talking about tobacco mainly is the one that sticks in people's heads. The science was clear in the 60s and 70s that it caused lung cancer. And then think about how long it took for that to come into government policy about, when I was a restaurant manager in the early noughties, people were smoking and it was all the smoke was up at waiters' head height. You can't even fathom that now. It doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous that you would allow that kind of harm to go on. But it takes 40 years. And I think changing a culture in terms of massive players' profit incentive is going to take time. I think it might be swifter with food, but that remains to be seen. I think part of the fight over, I think about meat versus plant-based in the political sense as like a battle over calories. So a lot of processed food companies like to come up with a brand which appeals to people. It might be under the guise of being plant-based, it might not be. But typically what you'll find is that it's a kind of unholy agglomeration of refined grains, vegetable oils, which are very cheap, sugar, which is very Moorish and cheap and does lots of things to food, which is attractive to makers. It might have other stabilizers and so on that helps to turn this mulch into a food-like substance. And then you package it and sell it at a massive profit. Now, you just can't do that with lamb chops. Lamb chops are lamb chops. And you need to have a lamb out on the fields to make it. So I think there's inherently something different about tobacco versus vaping compared to processed food versus really good, well-raised food. And I think that tension is going to be harder to resolve in one way, but appealing to people, like Tony said, in the population to take control of their own health is extremely powerful. And the best thing about it is it's actually a brilliantly rich and delicious and fulfilling way to eat. It's not about depriving yourself particularly. Every day I eat the most delicious, rich, unctuous foods, and it doesn't cost the earth, and it's I've never been healthier. So I think there's all these things about switching over, and I think once the public starts to vote with their wallet, the food companies will toe the line, and because they'll see a market and they'll respond to it.
Thank you. There's a few things coming out which is about doing a lot of that point about that nutrient density. So there's a few questions in terms of is there anywhere that you're aware of that's actually testing it and marketing it based on that nutrient density? Sorry.
Well, I think you get a few grass-fed suppliers who will do this. I mean, there are groups like Pasture for Life, Pasture-Free Dairy, and they will often quote things like the higher omega-3, the higher conjugated linoleic acid, which is an anti-cancerous and antioxidant, and there are lots of good things in meat. I don't know whether the public would really be interested or understand them in the main. you see, even doctors, I mean, I look at my medical education, the 40 years I was a doctor, if you'd thrown facts at me, like, you know, antioxidants, and most people thought of blueberries when they thought of antioxidants and things like that, and CLA, things like that, it didn't mean an awful lot. We understood about vitamins. But what we're beginning to understand now, there's wonderful science coming out now, not just about the gut microbiome, but also about how it seems to be important to have things in the context of the food they come in. It was a very interesting experiment done many, many years ago, where they thought that people who ate, well, they found that people who ate badly and smoked heavily had a higher incidence of lung cancer than those who ate a good diet and still smoked the same amount. And so they started giving them beta-carotene, and they had to stop because they found, in fact, giving beta-carotene as a supplement actually increased the risk of getting lung cancer. And I think we often think that supplements will make up for what we're missing in our food. And there's two problems with that. One is we don't understand everything that's in the food still, and we don't know how they're interacting. And we also don't know how the things interact together. And I think this is like the regenerative farming. There's a huge complexity in the soil, huge complexity in the way animals interact with that, and they become healthier. And we don't fully understand the whole interaction. But if we stick to what was kept us healthy for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, we're more likely to be on the right track, even if we don't fully understand it. But we now know, I mean, the wonderful things are in red meat. I mean, all these essential amino acids, vitamin B12, the fat-soluble vitamins, you know, lots of micronutrients, and the better the animals are reared, the higher the level of those nutrients are in the meat. So
and in terms of both, well, Bristol University, Aberystwyth, Queen's over in Belfast, and also Northwick down in Devon. I mean, they've all got a background in sort of measuring those levels of different nutrients in the meat that's produced from pasture and other diets.
Yes.
So those tests, I mean, as academic level, those tests exist. So we can determine the levels within meat. It's just how, as you say, who's willing to pay for that test, and what do we do with that information to then promote it to someone else?
In fact, Bristol University did some research, I think in about 2006, on lambs being raised on different types of pasture, showing the improvement in the meat content of micronutrients and that.
And the challenge tends to be is that it never gets to the high enough threshold to then be to be able to be used as an enriched food. That's some of the challenge. So it will increase, but not to a sort of it's too variable. So it might change to being, as animals come in off grass onto silage or whatever, and they're housed, or onto a different crop, it varies again. So it's quite a difficult one.
Yes, it is. But you see, I think the problem is not so much the nutrient density, which we're talking about, because we're close to the subject and we understand it. It's still this problem of saturated fat, that people will not eat meat because they've been told it contains saturated fat and that's going to give you a heart attack. And that's the biggest hurdle we've got at the moment.
100% agree. One of Steve Wright's factoids today encapsulates all of this. He said broccoli per calorie, I think he said, has more protein than steak and none of the saturated fat. Now, if there's a more garbled, unfortunate expression of the current understanding of nutrition in the Western world, I can't think of one. Can you imagine trying to get the same amount of protein from broccoli as you would from a steak? And unfortunately, as Tony says, the avoidance of saturated fat is pointless.
Tony, I was just going to ask, if I was obese and I came to you when you were a doctor or one of your colleagues now, what would, and they were kind of thinking in the old-fashioned method, what would the advice be?
Eat less and move more. It's the rant that all the doctors use. And you see, the Prime Minister is really worried about obesity. I mean, one thing that COVID-19 has shown us is that if you are obese, your risk of fatality from an infection is many, many times higher. And many of those are diabetic as well. And so what they've suggested is that we have an anti-obesity campaign. And what do they say? A high tax on anything with sugar, salt and fat in. Well, that's a nonsense. I mean, because you're not describing any food there. It's too general. There's a lot of misrepresentation of the value or otherwise of salt. I could go on all night about how much salt we could have and how good or otherwise some of the advice is about that. The fat, they don't differentiate between saturated fat and vegetable fats. And I would never touch the vegetable fats, don't touch them in my life at all. And I'd eat plenty of saturated fat. And also its combinations. So it's well known that if you have lots of vegetable oil fats with carbohydrates, it's highly inflammatory. And that's one of the worst diets you can have. So reaching for the donuts and the, you know,
chips.
It is the worst thing you could do. It's not just hips, it's heart.
Oh, sorry, chips.
Oh, yes, chips.
On the hips, yeah, but
chips on the hips, yeah. So, yeah, and then the other thing is, you said what the advice would be, so it's eat less, move more. If you actually go for, I don't know, 5 mile run or something, you're lucky if you've burnt off half the cupcake you have at the end when you meet your friend in the canteen afterwards. It just doesn't work like that. The interesting thing is, if you're sat down on a sofa, that is a considerable chunk of your metabolic activity that day. If you then do the housework, it increases by a certain percentage. If you go to the gym, it only increases it by a little bit more. And part of the secret is actually just to keep on the move all the time. And that ups your metabolic rate over a long period of time and alters what you're doing with your digestive system all the time. But going to the gym for an hour doesn't have that same effect.
Yeah, I had a guy called Professor Herman Pontzer on the podcast. He's a very interesting guy. And he went over to study the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, and it bore out exactly what Tony said. They expected, what they wanted to do was measure the calorific use every day of these hunter-gatherers. They thought the women are at home gathering around the dwelling with babies on their back and all the rest of it, and the men are out hunting 14 hours a day. So these people are going to be burning an insane number of calories. And what they found was that the only thing that determines how many calories you burn really is your lean body mass. So if you take a Hadza hunter-gatherer who's out hunting all day and compare that to someone of exactly the same lean body mass who's sitting at a desk in Slough, they're burning the same number of calories. And it sounds mental to say that, but there's no two ways about it. That's what the data shows. And so the phrase, you can't outrun a bad diet, is absolutely bang on. Although obviously you have to sort of say at the same time, exercise is, like Tony just did, the exercise is incredibly good for you and you should do it a lot.
Yeah, what exercise does do, it changes your insulin resistance, which then determines how you handle the food you do eat. So exercise has benefits, but it's not about burning calories off. And I did virtually no exercise for 3 months and lost my 3.5 stone. And so, you know, you could take someone who, say, is disabled and in a wheelchair and is, say, 20 stone and is stuffing themselves with the wrong food. And you could say, oh, you haven't got a hope in hell because you can't get out and exercise. That's absolute rubbish. I could get 10 stone off that person without any exercise. And only then really, perhaps, is anybody who's grossly overweight like that fit to actually start running, because their knees would cave in if you tried to put them through silly exercises.
And sorry, Nick, go on.
Well, no, I just wanted to go on to ice cream randomly.
Oh, just before you go, I'm just interested because we've picked up this vegetable oil is evil. I'm summarising, but I'm just interested in just exploring that a bit more before we move on to ice cream.
Well, there was this theory that polyunsaturated fats were the things to do to avoid saturated fats. That was what came out. And until about 1905, no human being had ever eaten in any quantity polyunsaturated fats. It was when a company called it was, I've forgotten the name of the company now, they're well known. They produced this fat called Crisco. They were soap manufacturers and they were losing money on the soap, and they changed their product to a vegetable oil, a corn oil. And there were huge advantages. It was liquid, it was cheap, and so people started cooking in it. But what it does, it gets laid down in our body in places where we shouldn't have these polyunsaturated fats. And far from actually preventing heart attacks, it bumps up the amount of omega-6 in your body to levels which are unnatural, and that actually is very inflammatory. And so many of our diseases, including heart attacks, osteoarthritis and things like that, the basis of them is inflammation. So okay, it may be hard work on your knees, it gives you osteoarthritis, but if you don't have an inflammatory thing to start with, you're likely to be able to undergo far more trauma to your knees before you get the osteoarthritis. And doctors still don't look at conditions like that and think about what can I do to reduce the inflammation as well as reducing the pain. They tend to go for the knife and knee replacement and things like that.
So that would be rapeseed oil.
Rapeseed oil, corn oil, safflower, all the oils.
Okay.
Rapeseed oil has more omega-3 than the others, but it's still pushing your omega-6 higher than we need it. You probably need about a ratio of 1 to 2, 1 to 3, and the ratio in lots of poor foods can be up to 26 to 1. So omega-6 to omega-3. Sorry, you're going to say, Ali?
Yeah, thanks. If anyone wants to really nerd out about this, then Tucker Goodrich is a guy who I've had on the podcast a few times, and he's really kind of taken up the baton on driving this forward. He's writing a book on it at the moment, and he gives a kind of potted history about how novel these oils are. Like Tony says, they're only 100 years old or so, and the key problem is a fat called linoleic acid, which is a fatty acid which is part of these oils, sometimes up to concentrations of 50–60%. Now, linoleic acid is an essential fatty acid, but we need a tiny amount. And in pasture-raised beef, you might find it at a concentration of 1% or so. And in these oils, it could be up to 50 or 60%. And the problem is that they compete with omega-3s in your cells to the point that they make your cellular environment unstable, and that they actually, when they degrade at body temperature, they directly damage your cellular structure and your DNA, and the breakdown products are carcinogenic. It's bad news to have high concentrations of this stuff in your body. And the kind of Tucker's take on why they make people fat is mainly that they drive the same process as cannabis does and give you the munchies, that they activate the cannabinoid pathway. And so when you're eating a curry that's laden in vegetable oils, it's very hard to stop. Everyone knows they overeat when they have a curry, because you're just not getting the feedback signals to stop eating. So there's all sorts of things wrong with vegetable oils. And I think for me as well, it's kind of an open and shut case when you start reading the history and the science, that definitely to be avoided. And the sort of grey area is, what do you do about olive oil or coconut oil or avocado oil? Well, olive oil is typically much lower, but it's non-zero. So I would suggest trying not to cook with it. But I still eat a lot of olive oil, and I just do make that choice. And coconut oil has pretty much zero. It's pretty much all saturated. So that's the kind of potted history of it from
the other thing about oils is the cooking temperature. That if you cook in beef fat or lard or coconut oil, you've got a much higher smoking point, so you're not going to degrade the oils to the same extent. You cook in vegetable oils, and they go rancid in storage very quickly, so they're oxidized, and that's quite bad for you in another way. And secondly, they've got very low smoking points compared.
Absolutely, and there's a decent study which suggests that women in China who've never smoked are getting lung cancer from cooking with these oils in woks.
So do you make your omelette with coconut oil?
No, I tend not to use coconut oil very much because it tastes coconut. So, like, typically, I'd maybe use it for making a curry or something. But
I use butter or ghee, or sometimes I put some cream in my if I make scrambled egg. Yeah, I eat loads of cream. Loads of cream.
So there's a question come in actually about cholesterol.
Right. Well,
probably best to let Tony take this.
I don't know. You're a man of facts. I mean, you're brilliant at your facts.
I've got a take on it, but I think you should answer this.
Well, the first thing is cholesterol is an essential building block of every cell wall in our body. And the second thing I'd say as a general fact is it doesn't matter how much or how little cholesterol you eat, it makes next to no difference how much cholesterol is in your blood, because your body adjusts accordingly. If you eat no cholesterol, your body makes it in the liver. The third thing is, when we talk about good and bad cholesterols, we're not really talking about the cholesterol, we're talking about something called a lipoprotein. Cholesterol is fat soluble, it cannot travel in your blood, which is water-based, so it needs an envelope of a very clever protein around it called a lipoprotein, which is okay with fats on the inside and okay with water on the outside. So it's like an envelope that carries the fat through your blood. And you've got high density lipoproteins and you've got low density lipoproteins. Now the trouble is that when the doctors do a blood test, they measure total cholesterol, which is the one they used to only do, which is a meaningless figure. They now break it down to HDL, high density lipoprotein, which they call the good one. And they work it out by a calculation what's left as the lower density lipoprotein, and they also look at triglycerides. Well, the first thing is that high density lipoprotein is raised if you've got a low carb diet, and that's good. The second thing is you can break down lipoproteins further into lots of different types, and you've got to do a very expensive test with nuclear magnetic resonance, which we don't do in the NHS, in order to differentiate that. And there's only one type that's bad. It's called ApoB, and it's the amount, it's a tiny particle, and the number of particles you have. And then the final thing is triglycerides, and they're really damaging. And if you go on a low carb diet, you notice your HDL goes up and your triglyceride drops dramatically because you make your triglycerides from carbs. And that is a very healthy ratio to have. So if you have a blood test done at the doctor's, ask for your HDL and your triglyceride and look at the ratio and ask the doctor to comment on that.
On this, the concern is that the cholesterol is high, and so the doctor is concerned about the high. So it's about potentially looking at that ratio, isn't it?
It's looking at the ratio, and also if you look at people outcomes with heart attacks, then high cholesterol or low cholesterol had exactly the same outcome of heart attacks, even in the Framingham studies, which everybody quotes. Everybody thinks that it was a factor, so all they try and do is alter it as a factor. So they give you statins, and that will lower it, definitely lower it. But it's interesting, the lower your cholesterol goes, especially your LDL, the more you get cancer, the more suicides happen, and people will die of different things. So it's quite bad for you. And if you actually do other things that are non-inflammatory for your heart attack, by keeping diabetes at bay and being low carb, then you actually won't get the heart attacks and you won't get the cancers either. So, you know, people tend to look at these markers and decide on what you should do from the markers rather than look at the outcomes. And the outcomes are whether you get a heart attack or a stroke or not. And the Framingham studies that are not talked about actually show that it doesn't make a hoot of difference what your cholesterol level is. There's a rare example where people have a hypercholesterolemia, where they have a genetic problem, but it's not the high cholesterol that causes it. They happen to have high cholesterol. There are other reasons why they get lots of heart attacks. People would disagree with me on that, but there is scientific evidence to support that view.
And there's just a comment also to support the sort of discussion about sort of type of exercise. So the lean body mass is best achieved with resistance training as opposed to cardio. Combining this with the types of diets that are being discussed needs more promotion.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, don't look at me, I don't do enough exercise, I'm terrible, my wife tells me that. But I think the older you get, the more muscle wasting you get, and the older you get, the more you should do resistance exercise. It's more important almost than aerobic exercise. But also, I used to be a sports medicine doctor as well. And one of the things that people often don't understand about exercise is it only benefits you in the rest period. So these people who are exercising all day, every day, are actually if you do a muscle biopsy of muscle after it's gone through extreme exercise, it's horrific. All the cell structure is breaking down, cells are leaking all over the place. And the purpose of that is to rebuild in a stronger way. So you've got to give time for rebuilding. And I've had people who were going off to the Olympics and they were over exercising. And I said, you've got to go to bed for a day or two. I can't do that, I can't do that. But their performance was dropping. And the minute they did that, their performance went up again because they're allowing their body to rebuild the cells they're damaging by the exercise. So you can over-exercise. So I think moderate aerobic exercise, and I think resistance exercise is quite important.
And a question for Ali, which is it better to fry eggs in beef dripping than sunflower oil? I think I might know the answer to that.
100%. Yes. And
you've made Sarah Morris's mum very happy.
Beef dripping's great. My girlfriend tends to prefer butter because it tastes of more, I suppose. I think it is very moreish and tastes better, but I like dripping because it's very filling. And I think that's telling about its nature and how well matched it is to us as a food. And so if I have my way, I usually just use dripping. If she's looking, I'll go half and half, dripping and butter. But never sunflower oil, never, ever, ever.
Are there any more questions on red meat? Because I'm sure there's people who want support about having red meat.
There's a couple. Well, just one. Juanita just saying is so good health is more down to keeping inflammation at bay, and does red meat help that directly?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we mentioned about omega-6 being very inflammatory. The ratio between omega-3 and omega-6 in red meat is very close to the perfect norm. So that's one good thing about it. And red meat's full of antioxidants. And as I say, to get inflammation down, you've got to do a lot of things. Things I haven't mentioned so far, but are important, is getting adequate sleep. We can demonstrate even one night of bad sleep can give you a diabetic curve on your glucose tolerance curve the next day. Reducing stress. By that, I don't mean single stressful events, but chronic stress, where all the time you're under stress. Getting exercise, eating plenty of nutrient-dense food and highly coloured things. Lots of highly coloured vegetables actually give you a better microbiome. And then meat is, I mean, some people are just carnivores and they seem to do really well health-wise on it. They don't have any vegetables at all. I'm not a pure carnivore, but if you look at it, people who are on plant-based diets need supplements. People who are on total meat diets don't need anything else. So it's interesting that our bodies respond better to that than just a plant-based diet. And also anatomically, if you look at the length of our gut and how it's made, we have a very short colon relative to, say, a gorilla. People often say, well, look at gorillas eat leaves all day. They do occasionally eat meat. They kill a chimpanzee or something, or a small monkey. But their colon is enormous because they depend on fermentation, a bit like the rumen of cattle, but they do it in their large gut to produce fats, actually, free fatty acids, which they feed on, and they make from the carbohydrates and the fibers in the leaves they eat. We've got a very short colon and a very long small intestine, which fits with an omnivore.
And there's just a, oh, sorry, Nick.
Yeah,
there's just...
well, sorry, I was just going to ask Ali how he cooks his steak. The question come in.
Oh yeah, well,
or any meat.
Any meat. Well, I mean, I could shamelessly plug my cookbook at this point.
Well, yes, do Have you got one to hold up?
Low carb on a budget. It's digital only at the moment, but the paperback will be coming out later in the year. But yeah, the many varied ways. You know, mince could be in sort of burgers or koftas. Steak, always rare, and I really like the cheaper cuts like rump or bavette, flank, all that sort of thing. And it's just more the way you do the steak. So I usually heat it in a warm oven for 5 minutes or so that it's warmed through, and then I sear it for a minute either side, and then let it rest. Crucially, let it rest in a warm place for 5 minutes. And even if you've got a cheaper cut, it'll still be really tender. I mean, I prefer red meat, so beef and lamb are the main things. The slower cooked cuts are probably my favorite overall. Lamb shoulder, I think, would be, if I had to choose one meat, that would be it. And I just stick it in a pot with some water or chicken stock, some vegetables, and give it, 2 or 3 hours.
I know Peter, who's asked that question, I'm thinking it's the right Peter, has got pigs. Now, if you had outdoor pigs in comparison to indoor pigs, what would the difference be when you were cooking it?
So for me, the cooking wouldn't change, except the thing more about the pigs for me is what they're fed. It's very difficult, and I think it's difficult to find pigs that aren't fed grains primarily, because that's what is commercially more viable. But unfortunately, the fats in grains persist into the pig's fat as this linoleic acid to a higher degree than with ruminants fed grains, whose rumens don't persist. They create their own saturated fatty acids and other fatty acids that go into the animal. So I just eat less pork than I do ruminants because of that. Actually, I love pork, but I eat it less because of that. And if I've struggled to find anyone who feeds them, say, only tubers or something that doesn't contain the linoleic acid.
It's interesting you say that, because I usually do the washing up after we've done the roast, and when we have say something quite fatty like loin of pork, the in the meat tray, it doesn't go solid anymore like it used to, whereas the fat and the lamb and the beef fat, they all go solid, and it tastes like vegetable oil too. I've come to dislike it. I said to my wife the other day, I don't like this pork. It's not. I don't like the taste of the fat.
It can actually make me feel nauseated, and
yeah.
that's the sign for me.
Yeah. Whereas I eat loads of fat without feeling nauseated in other ways. I have full fat yogurts, lots of fatty cheese, cream, raw milk. Never feel problems.
Fatty beef.
I'm just conscious of time. Ice cream, Ali.
Oh yeah.
Let's have some pudding at the end.
Yeah, well, I've just launched my sugar-free ice cream, and having spoken negatively about ultra-processed foods, I've got absolutely no doubt that this could be categorized as an ultra-processed food. But it's kind of based on a luxury ice cream, so it's made with double cream, pasteurized egg, and it's got some milk protein in there because the structure is different without sugar, and it's got natural sweeteners which don't spike blood sugar. So I'm really proud of it. I think it tastes like the real thing. The kind of all the kids that have tried it say they can't tell the difference, which is great. And we're just rolling it out just now in Scotland at the moment. But we're also, when we release batches, we sold out our first batch, and some of that was sold around the UK. And I think for a lot of people, it'll it'll sound like a bad idea because it's a sweet thing. It might kind of trigger binge eating in some people and so on. But I think for other people, like me, when I first started eating like that, I ate sugar-free ice cream made with sweetener, and it was a great bridge away from the junk food that I used to eat. And I think it's a treat. I wouldn't suggest that it's to be eaten 3 meals a day, but I think my philosophy on diet is not absolutist at all. I usually say to people, if you're making 1 out of 10 good decisions right now when you eat, then if you up that every week or every month so that by the end you're making 8 out of 10 good decisions and 2 out of 10 bad ones, then brilliant. You know, that's huge, and that'll make all the difference. So to me, it's part of that, and it's a technology thing as well. I think the technology has only just really become available to get it so that it actually tastes like sugar. And I think with technology, you know, you should use it, and you know, as best you can, because you can't put technology back in the box. It's out there. So I think it's just another tool that people can use and something that people can enjoy. Hopefully, it's called Scoundrel, which hopefully plays on the idea that it's a bit naughty, but you're getting away with it.
So how do people find it if they want to? Your website, what is it? Paleo Canteen. Is that the link?
That's right, paleocanteen.co.uk, and there's information about the cookbook and Scoundrel ice cream and the podcast. I've also started selling cured meat, so I've called it Cured by Paleo Canteen, and it's at the moment we've got South African snacks. So we've got biltong and drovers, and for those who don't know, biltong's made from beef silverside, and you cure it for about 5 days in spices and then slice it, and it's lovely, very lean. And then for those who maybe want some more fat, the drovers is made with a special 50-50 fat to lean mix, and you mince it and mix it with spices and put it into a sausage and then cure it, and you get this lovely rich preserved snack that I think is something that it's portable as well. So I think that's something that low carb people kind of struggle with sometimes, is finding that.
Can I just mention a nice dessert that's quick and easy? You take some frozen raspberries and you just get full fat Greek yogurt, and then just you're about to serve it, you mix the frozen raspberries straight from the freezer with the yogurt, and it's like ice cream.
Would 100% agree. It's amazing.
I like that we're going to do a different one, which is cooking with Tony and Ali. It's coming up next.
Is there anything else that we have missed, or Liz, is there any more questions?
There's just the final one that's one that's come in, which is I understand that the body reacts to sweet whether or not it contains calories, and does your insulin levels spike anyhow? I'm guessing that sugar-free ice cream. So just because it's sweet, you have that feeling of sweet, does it push up your insulin levels?
I'd say there's ambiguity in the data on this, and I think there's individual variety too. You know, I'm looking forward to a time when we all have smartwatches that tell you your continuous glucose measurement, because that will really tell you if a particular sweetener is spiking your insulin. But the problem is most sweeteners that are used for bulk and sweetness definitely do spike your insulin, like maltitol. But erythritol, which I use, and stevia just pass through. So there really shouldn't be a spike. And the idea that sweetness can spike your insulin, I think in my head that's ambiguous in the data, but it's certainly sweetness can provoke increased appetite. So this is why I say for some people it's a bridge away from junk food, and for other people it essentially is junk food. So, you know, you really have to just decide for yourself which it is. But I'm sure Tony's got something to say about it.
It's interesting. People have shown somewhere there's a part of your brain called the amygdala, and when you take drugs of addiction like cocaine and that, it becomes very active. and it wants you to stimulate it again. And that's where the addiction comes from. And some people reckon that they've demonstrated in some specialist type of MRI scan that when people eat sugar, they can demonstrate the amygdala lights up. Not in everybody. There seem to be a group of people who get addicted to sugar and others who don't. And similarly in those people, sometimes if they eat artificial sweeteners, they get the same lighting up the amygdala. So it would certainly stimulate your appetite. And then others have said that their insulin spikes, not necessarily the glucose, but their insulin spikes, almost if it's in readiness because it's expecting a sweetness. So you get the sweetness on the tongue and your body immediately responds with the insulin to say manage the sugar that isn't actually there. And of course, when the insulin goes up, that can be difficult.
Okay. Thank you.
But I agree with Ali. It's an area needs further research.
We've just had a statement that yes, they would like Cooking with Tony and Ali to be a regular feature. So that's good news. And the other thing, which is
my wife, she's the best cook.
The other thing, which is because of our love of crunch nut of cornflakes and the statement about cornflakes, what are we trying to avoid, Nick? Is the question or a statement earlier.
And when we had a talk with Ali maybe 10 days ago, I did for a week have no carbs. And I did feel, Ali, I ate a lot of eggs, I have to say, a lot of eggs. But I did feel really good. And I felt kind of slightly sharper than I am. I'm not that sharp. But I miss the texture of like
crunch
carbs, yeah. But I did feel good, and I have kind of, I'm having some carbs, so I'm probably more on your wavelength, Tony. Less carbs, but still some.
Would you feel for me? My father was a baker, and I used to bake handmade bread, and people used to say my bread was delicious, and I love the smell of bread, and I don't eat it now. But funnily enough, I've actually become allergic to wheat. I cannot, it's got nothing to do with my diet. I just cannot eat anything with wheat in it. So even though I agree with Ali that there are occasions when you break the rules because, you know, it's a special occasion. So birthdays, Christmas, I used to sort of have Christmas cake and birthday cake, even though most of the year I wouldn't eat it. I can't do that now.
But I think it's quite, I think, so Reno, my husband, will come in and he'll have a big lunch of starchy stuff, and then he feels like he needs to sleep, and that's the feeling that I want to get away from.
Yeah,
so won't I, Ali?
That certainly does the trick for me. You know, I have my energy levels, mental and physical, are higher and much more even through the day.
One final question for Juanita, because it's the same as me, which is I get hangry when I do keto and paleo or Atkins, very angry. And well, I do, I'm not sure about Juanita. And how can I avoid them on kind of diets? Do we just need to keep pushing on?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that not everybody is suited to a keto diet, but sometimes people have got to realize that they have to go at the right pace. And also they may not be doing some very basic things. Firstly, you should drink a lot more water. Second, you need a lot more salt, because you leach salt out your body very fast if you don't have carbohydrates, and you leach water out. So that's two things you need to do. A lot of people don't do that, and that can often make a huge difference. And also people say, oh, I get constipated. But again, if you have more salt and water, that tends to put that right. And
They sometimes causes constipation as well. I think people who kind of throw in a lot of cheese in a keto setting can find that, you know, they're constipated, they don't know why. Yeah.
But
on that note,
water constipation seems not get back from that, Nick. Go.
I know. Well, I don't know, but I've just loved that last hour and a half, and I'm not constipated, Ali. It's all good. All good. Well, I've adjusted well. Yeah, that's been really good.
Water.
Really interesting.
Water, and Peter's suggestion is lots of pickled eggs and fried and sausages. Ready for a snack.
I would say that
I reckon
in terms
pork crackling.
in terms of the hangry thing, you know, it takes a while for your gut microbiome to change to how you're eating, and we have microbes that demand sugar from, you know, demand we eat sugar, and can make us very irritable if we're not eating sugar. But they will die.
I've got a lot of them.
Yeah, they will die if you stay the course.
It can take anything from 4 days to about 2 or 3 weeks to adjust. And you should adjust your exercise levels as well, and your stress levels. You don't pick a time when you're in the middle of stress and heavy workloads to start a keto diet.
So just to roll this back to a meat producer's point of view, in your opinion, the future for red meat producers is all good, positive, rosy?
Oh, I think they've got a difficult battle on their hand. I mean, never before have I seen so much interest in veganism. Apparently, if you look at the Google counts, veganism is way up there above every other diet. People are really lashing into it. And people talk about, like you said, Steve Wright and things like that. So I think there's a battle, but I think we've got to be on the side of logical sense, biochemistry, human evolution, human health, soil, all sorts of things. Everything goes for producing ruminant animals, which we should be eating. I think that's extremely important. And I'd be there backing them up left, right and centre.
Okay.
Perfect.
I think we should, it's 9:03.
Yes, sorry. Thank you very much. It's been really interesting. I am
Thank you
going
for
to
asking
deal
me.
with my I'm going to deal with my carb issues. That's what I'm going to do.
Yes.
But thank you very much. Really interesting. And so, yeah, really interesting questions. Lots very different approach. Like, I mean, it's a very different subject for us to cover. So that's been really good from that regard. And trying to get that better link between how those animals are reared and what they do in terms of once they are being eaten. So really interesting. Thank you very much, Tony and Ali. Nic, in terms of the plan for the next one is talking to Jan Ledoux, really focusing on herbal lays and particular focus on sheep, and hopefully bullying Rich Thomas to come and have a chat with us about tall grass grazing for sheep. So the next one in September will be a focus on sheep production.
Great. Well,
So
Jan's on
dates
the
will be
line, I
out.
can see.
Yes.
Yeah.
He is aware of
Thanks.
this. Rich is just about.
Grand. Well, thank you to all our listeners, to Tony and Ali, and yeah, really enjoyed that.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And me too. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I hope we make lots more communications. It'd be great.
And we're looking forward to the cooking section shortly.
And also, you probably have lots of offers of people that want to lend you their farm to do all kinds of stuff, Ali.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye then.
all.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.